All right, so before we move on to the next engine mount, which I'm super excited about, we need to discuss something about engine placement. There's a lot of videos out there on YouTube. I'll probably even link some of my preferred ones on YouTube in the description. One thing that people don't generally talk about, because it usually doesn't matter a whole lot, is essentially the placement of an engine in an engine bay left to right, and that's relationship to parallelism as it relates to your pinion or drive shaft. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to take some measurements because we don't want to move too far forward before we've made an irreversible change. So first, let's discuss some of my choices I've already made that you haven't necessarily heard me talk about, I don't think. So one of the things is that my engine is not actually centered. And crazy as it might seem, the factory engine wasn't centered either. And if you set up a laser sitting in the exact center of the car, aiming down the center, it's not going to hit the drive shaft pinion. It'll actually be about 1 inch. It'll be about 1 inch to the right. So the factory engine was actually about 3/4 of an inch or 1 inch left of center. The drive shaft is about that same distance towards that right side of the car. Left if you're looking from the front. But that's this is left-hand drive, that's right-hand drive. So towards the right. The whole drive line's aligned that way. Now, I'm actually not going to be centered. I'm actually going that way. I can get away with this partially because I have a smaller transmission, smaller than what other people use. A lot of people love the CD 009 transmission. It's a great transmission. Nothing against that transmission. It is a big girl of a transmission. That transmission weighs almost as much as this engine as you see it now. This is, as it sits, about 240 pounds. A CD 009 is like 190 pounds, I think, last I checked. I would have to, you can fact check me if you want, interwebs. But anyway, point being is that it's a beefy transmission. I know guys have done 500 plus wheel horsepower through the S2000 transmission. I'm also going to be in a lighter car. I'm not going to be running huge tires. If I break a transmission, so be it. These are actually not so unavailable as you might think. They're actually relatively easy to get, especially AP1s, because everybody wants to switch to AP2 transmissions for some reason, plus they're also newer, et cetera. But you can still find brand new parts from Honda. If you want to replace a gear set, they're still available from Japan, from Honda. So, all that being said, that's the transmission I've gone with. Because of it, it's a more lithe transmission. It's a little bit more slender. So it allows me a little bit more freedom as far as placement. I'm also wanting to tilt the back of the engine as far up as I can physically get it into the tunnel, which might seem like it's counterproductive for lowering center of gravity, but that's also for making room for exhaust, also room for potentially a skid plate. But also the higher you make the engine, the lower you can relatively set the whole car. A lot of your ride heights are going to be based upon how well does everything tuck up under the car. How much of your oil pan is exposed? How low does your exhaust hang? The more you can get everything up into the chassis, the lower you can actually run the whole thing. So while I don't plan on scraping the ground with this thing, I don't plan on being that low, it's nice to know that I've got the flexibility. And also if I do hit road debris, that, I'm a little bit more protected for what may happen. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. I need to put this bushing back in. But because essentially what I've done now is I've created one solid point of reference that relatively limits my motion, and that's okay. It'll allow a couple of degrees of movement, which is fine. But what I need to do tonight, before we move forward with the other mount, is I need to verify how far over this is and where the transmission's pointing, and figure out where that angle is and make sure I'm actually sitting parallel to the pinion on the drive shaft. So we all know a bit about this if you do any research, that your tilt back of your engine, especially on older carbureted engines, needs to be set so to a certain specific point, especially if you have carburetors. So, your carburetor base plate has to be level, right? And because that is a set known value, if you're setting up your rear suspension, you set your pinion angle to match whatever your engine transmission output ends up sitting at with wherever your carburetor sits. If you're doing a custom engine swap, you can kind of set this however you want based upon certain factors, but most importantly, you have to be aligned with your pinion. So let me find a demonstration tool to help illustrate this. All right, so here's what I got: 2 bolts. One represents the axis of rotation of the crankshaft and thus transmission, and one will represent the axis of rotation of the differential. These can be essentially anywhere in space within reason, as long as they're pointing completely parallel. So they can be offset this way as long as they're spinning perfectly parallel this direction and this direction, right? That they're essentially perfectly parallel lines, where if you measure the distance over here, you measure the distance over here, that they're the same distance. So where that tends to not be as loose of a rule is the shorter the drive shaft gets, because the shorter the drive shaft gets, the more extreme these angles have to be that the drive shaft has to make those turns. So people with really short drive shafts, like in an AC Cobra, for example, you've got such a short drive shaft that any difference in angle is extreme, and thus also any impact on a actual rotation angle shift ends up being a huge factor for them. So a lot of guys with short drive shafts have to struggle with drive shaft vibrations. For some of them, it's a way of life. For other ones, it's something that they chase constantly and sometimes figure out, sometimes don't. So all that to say, most people on YouTube, when they're talking about setting all these angles, they're mostly talking about engine tilt back and also potentially adjusting your pinion on your differential to match. Not many people have situations in cars where the actual engine is offset left to right in the engine bay. So where that's really going to come into play is that if you're, let's just say, John Smith or John Doe setting up an engine in a S30 chassis, if you put the nose of the transmission perfectly centered in the engine bay, measuring across the frame rails, or using the tie rod ends, or using the cross member, however you decide to measure that, you find perfect center of the vehicle, you put a mark there, and you put your harmonic balancer in front of the crankshaft, dead center. And then if you take, let's just say, a laser, and set up a laser on the tail shaft and aim the tail shaft at your differential, what you've effectively done, exaggerating, is you've moved the engine this direction and then aimed it that way. And what you've just done is you've just created angle. A degree may not matter. Where that will start to matter, especially in an S30, is the S30 already had from the factory a lot of engine tilt, and the differential was nose up to accommodate. Now, you can make a custom front mount for your differential and bring that right back down. How many people do? How many people have issues? I don't know, but it's something to think about. So if you have drive shaft vibrations in your S30, maybe measure that pinion angle. Anyway, so you already have some offset from the factory, and they were not perfectly aligned. Usually they're, from what I can guesstimate looking on the internet, the factory transmission and differential difference was at least a degree from what people generally see on the differential versus what people generally see as tilt back on the engine. So to take that for what it's worth, you already have a degree that you're off anyway. My concern is that you don't want to add even more, which then limits your ability to adjust or to fix problems with the easy to solve problem, which is the differential. Because you can make a Ron Tyler style front differential mount for your differential, And then you can move that nose of the differential up and down really easily. I can't easily change where the pinion points left to right, whether it's aiming towards the front left tire or the front right tire. That's not easy to change. So that's what we need to measure, and that's what we need to get essentially set in stone before we make the next mount. All right, I've turned my lights off in here, so at least, well, here. I've turned my lights off in here so you can see my laser. If you don't have one of these, they're super handy to get one. You can get ones that are self-leveling, like they actually like wobble inside, so you don't have to just rely on the body being level. And I have this in its unlocked mode right now. Unfortunately, it doesn't get to, I have a mark right down there. It's hard to see in this light, but I'll show you. So I've measured and marked out the center of the cowl, and I'm using the back of the hatch lock mechanism as the center point reference. Those, as far as I can tell and measure, are as centered as I can find on the chassis. The one thing to think about here is that just because you have a level plane doesn't mean that plane couldn't be like this, offset, and still hitting that mark and that mark. But you wouldn't be centered way down here, right? If it's coming down at a sliced angle like that. So that's also why it's useful to have a couple of different points at various heights, which is also why I've got a mark down there. And if I just tilt this up and make it unhappy, it intersects right through my mark that I have. So what that means is as long as I don't bump it, I can use that now as a reference to measure against. And I can measure the distance offset at the crankshaft center here, and then try to find a spot where I can put a mark inside the car, hopefully, to reference center at the tail shaft of the transmission. Make sense? I hope so. Let me get this moved around a little bit and set up, and I'll show you what I mean. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this line coming across the windshield, and I've also got a nice line right there behind the seats. I'm just gonna set up a straight edge between those 2 points and try to get that planed down at the transmission. So I'm not gonna be able to get this on camera, but I have a giant T-square that I've set at the back, right where the mark was laying back there. And I'm using the light that's coming through the windshield to go run down this length as much as I can to get it level and square. And I can see when I'm misaligned or not. And that gives me my straight shot to where it's landing there. So I need my hand back. I'm gonna go put some tape down and mark this. All right, I'm actually really happy with how that turned out. I knew the theory was sound, but what was really reassuring is that when I had the T-square in there, and I would think, oh well, does that look like it's coming up straight and down? If I move the base just over a little bit, I could clearly see a difference with how it would show up coming down the length of the edge of the T-square. That leads me to think that is at least within a 1/4 inch accurate of center of the vehicle. And again, notice the whole center of this factory shifter hole is shifted towards the right side of the vehicle about a full inch. So this is good to know because look, my tail shaft needs to go left quite a lot because my crankshaft is way over here. So the tail shaft is a bit left of center. So, and this is a pretty fat, ugly mark. The actual center is like that little itty bitty dot right there. That's true center. All right, so that said, I need to now put the bushings back in the other, I need to put the bushings back in that other mount, get all that bolted in, and then get this tail shaft moved over and measure everything out. So give me a few minutes to get that all set up and show you how it goes. All right, so some progress. You can see this shifter tube is nice, a nice good center point reference here on the transmission. And it is actually probably just about in line with that mark. It might be aiming slightly left, but not much, which is fine. It's fine. My crankshaft here, it's landing like a quarter inch to the right of that dot. It's really stinking close. In other words, it's close enough. I'm not too worried about it. This definitely puts me in the ballpark so that when I put in the other mount, I'm not gonna have so little wiggle room that I can't get the transmission where it belongs. Now, that said, the transmission needs to go down just a little bit because I am making contact with the transmission tunnel. I can't get it to willingly go down much right now because of the way I've got it sitting on a cinder block. That cinder block wants to hold the engine level, or the plane that cinder block's on. And I've also got it blocked up with some wood shims. I've just got some pieces of wood under there to get it to the right height to work with. Once it is just on mounts, it'll have a lot more freedom to tilt up and down, and I can get that tilt down just that little bit I need to move it just a little bit further over when I go to make the transmission mounts. I'm talking quarter inch. I'm not talking about yanking on the thing after I get the mounts welded up. So I know now that I'm in the ballpark. Now, I'm realizing that I haven't answered the question of why am I not running the engine centered? There's a few reasons for that. The biggest reason is that I'm trying to do this as budget conscious as I can. I am not what I would consider poor, but I also don't like wasting money for no reason. I like the idea of keeping something as simple as possible and iterating. My most important goal with this isn't to have the best, fastest car, etc. I want to drive this. I want to drive it as soon as possible and start enjoying it and have that motivation of doing what you might consider a rolling resto or a rolling project. I want to get back in the car ASAP. That's the goal. In that design motif, I'm using the factory, it's not there. I'm using the factory exhaust manifold. It's just imagine. You saw it in other videos. If you see it in other videos, you'll notice that the outlet I've already cut the flange off of it, the factory stuff, because I'm gonna weld an extension on it. And it needs to clear the side of the chassis. It has to clear the engine bay. So instead of trying to hack off the flange and bringing the whole thing in an inch, it's much easier just to move the engine over just a little bit because it was really close. In fact, I probably could have, if I wanted to, say got a 3-inch bend, opened it up a little bit, like cuts a slot in it, opened it up, and just kind of turned it to massage it a little bit, and I probably could have made it fit even with the dead center. But why give myself the extra challenge when I can prevent further challenges down the line, which then helps me, again, get in the car sooner? Is a factory exhaust manifold going to make the most power? No. I don't need 500 horsepower. I have a turbo to put on this in the future. Do I need it? No. That's fine. I'm just trying to make the minimum viable product as fast as I can without limiting my ability to change things in the future. There is some other added benefits, though, of moving the engine over. This engine is tilted that way, which is fine. I mean, so my oil pan is level to the ground. This is how the engine wants to sit. Some people have really tight hood clearances on their K-swaps, and it's understandably so. Now, I'm also further back than some people. But I'm also not trying to get it as low as possible because, again, ground clearance. And again, I don't want to use the K20 oil pan and deleting the balance shafts and all that. And the 2-liter oil pump, that becomes a whole separate project, guys. Like, just slow down. Slow down. We can do that in the future, especially if it becomes a problem. If I blow up an engine because I revved it too high because of balance shafts, that's fine. Putting another motor in after the swap is done is much easier than never finishing the swap because I'm afraid of all the things I need to do while I'm here. Doing the most I can with what I have. All right, so all that said, I'm not as absolutely low as I could be. The engine could technically be lower. I'm actually probably going to be slightly above the cross member. Maybe. It's hard to say. You got to remember also, once this is on its mount, it's going to probably sag a little bit because of give on each of the mounts. So it's going to come down just a little bit, which is fine. Because again, future Nathan can put in a skid plate or, aero pan, whatever you want to think of it, call it. I can have an under tray. An under tray can sit, a 1/4 inch down from the cross member if it has to. But point being, my engine's a little bit higher than maybe some. I'm also a lot further back because I'm going as far back as I reasonably can without making future Nathan really angry about not being able to get it to any bolts. I can still get to everything. I can still remove the aftermarket coolant housing. I'm even going to be running, because this is essentially the high point in the coolant system. So this makes sense to have my radiator cap here versus way down over there where you're going to have more air pocket issues. So leaving enough space here to get to all that makes sense. So could I be further back because I'm not running a hood latch? Yeah, it could be further back. Here's the other challenge. If I go further back, even if I was centered, now the tail shaft has to go further down and the transmission goes down with it, and then it's a whole chain of events. Where this is sitting, it should clear the hood. But also, by having it, like again, I said, just that 1 inch further right, it's probably not even an inch, gives this more than a snowball's chance of hell to not hit the hood. So anyway, I know this is probably going to be a long video, lots of rambling. I would apologize, but this is the kind of content of why I'm doing this channel, why I'm posting stuff on here. Not many people talk through their process. Huge fan of Al, Turbo Yoda. Definitely watch the Skid Factory. For me, the value of that channel is him talking through his process. Not enough people talk through their process and tell you why they're making certain decisions and why they're going about things the way they are. That's the knowledge that sometimes keeps maybe you from doing your project or tackling your dream or doing the next mod on your vehicle. Maybe it's not even a car. Maybe you just need somebody who can inspire you to just think through the process. Take your time, don't rush it, but just keep moving forward. That's probably all I have time for right now. Like I said, this is probably already too long of a video. So I'll see you on the next one and keep jamming.